We're going to go through most of the information on page 15 fairly quickly, and I type it out. The first few times I taught this class, I had lots of blanks there, and I realized people were spending half an hour writing this stuff down, and I didn't think that was very helpful. So now I just have it all typed on there. We're going to talk about 4 parenting styles, or 4 authority styles, and these are really 4 leadership styles if you get right down to it. These don't just apply to parenting, they can apply to a boss subordinate relationship, or lots of different kinds of relations. They can apply to a husband-wife relationship or a wife-husband relationship. And some of these styles are pretty dysfunctional, and I think you're going to see why. So we're going to deal with it in 2 parameters, either a lot of them or a little bit of them. One is love and one is limits. Love and limits. And the first one, which is autocratic, limits are much greater than love. The limits are much greater than love. In this style, I'm just reading right off the page for now, the relationship is far less important to parents than the rules. They're the boss, they know they're the boss, and they want the kid to know that they're the boss, basically 24/7. Number 2, there are lots of rules. There's absolute authority, and in this style, they are absolutely lording it over the kids. Number 3, severe forms of the autocratic style take the form of physical abuse. Physically abusive parents fall into the extreme variant of the autocratic style of leadership. Number 4, there are lots of good homes here, and I use that in quote marks, big quote marks. There are lots of good homes here. Lots of stuff is provided, physical needs are met, but no emotional connection is really there. Emotional needs aren't met. There's really just not any support. Number 5, either outward fight, outward rebellion, or inward flight, i.e. withdrawal. Either rebellion on the outside or withdrawal on the inside are the typical result of this form of parenting. And number 6, and this is really sad, kids disperse when they are of age. When they get old enough, they're gone, and a lot of times mom and dad don't realize why they're not really hearing from them. And this is a very sad state of affairs later on when the parents would like to have more of a relationship with the kids. The second one is permissive. In the permissive style, love, and I'm using that word a little bit in quotes here, but love is much greater than limits. And we see parents like this all around us. At least I certainly did when our kids were young. In this style, support and acceptance of almost all actions is virtually unconditional. As we've gone through the 6 A's, this is our last A that we're going to cover today. As we've gone through the 6 A's, which A is it imperative that it be unconditional? What is it? Acceptance, right? Which is really another way to express love. Our love for our kids, our acceptance of our kids should be unconditional. Which A right after that one, if anyone remembers, is not unconditional, is indeed conditional on what they do, which is also important. Does anyone remember that one? It was appreciation. So what they do is also important. It isn't that what they do is not important, but we love them all the time, no matter what they're doing. So they can screw up big time. We still love them, but you know what? We're going to discipline them because we love them. We're going to do that because we love them. In the permissive parenting style, acceptance of virtually all actions is confused with acceptance of the person. So the parents think they have to say good job even when the boy is shoving his sister's head into the toilet. Everything is good job. I like the way you shoved your sister's head in the toilet. Could you stop doing that? There are some things that just need to be responded to in a little different way than that. Number 2, there are no real rules. In fact, the kids keep the parents hostage. And again, we see this played out sometimes in restaurants or at Target or Walmart or places like that. There are frequent parental threats of action with little or no follow-through. Now remember, your kids are smart and they're logical, so when there are frequent threats of parental action but no follow-through, what does the kid learn from that?
You don't really mean it.
You don't, who said that? You don't really mean it. It's exactly what they learn. You're training them, in fact, that you don't mean it. You're teaching them that. The child enjoys the game. He or she actually has the authority in this style of relationship. Your child actually has the authority. and they're whipping you back and forth like you're on a leash. And I would say this is what I liken to the early version of positive parenting. Way back in the 70s and 80s, and when we, sort of the tail end of this is when we were having our first kids, there was a lot of secular parenting coursework, and it emphasized the words positive parenting. And I think it was like this: everything was positive. You weren't supposed to say anything negative. You didn't have stoplights. You had go lights, because stoplights sounded negative. I mean, let's be real. Let's be real. Some things just aren't good, and they have to be addressed as being, you know what, that's just not good. That's not acceptable. We're going to deal with that. Doesn't mean I don't love you, but we're going to deal with it. C is indifferent. Simply stated, there are no limits and no love. It's just detached. That is perhaps, I don't know which of these first three is the most dysfunctional, but this one's very dysfunctional. The child has no connection at all. It's not abusive, but it's just detached. It's neglectful. So merely coexisting under one roof. The parents often provide everything the kids need, and they view the things that they provide as love, but in fact there's no emotional level connection at all. What we're after here is balanced, but I'm going to explain. There's a few modifications to this that I think are really important to understand, which I'm going to explain this morning. So we're after balanced, which is love with limits. Love with limits. And who has the Ephesians 6, 1 through 4? By the way, you guys have the highest tech markers I've ever seen. This is really, I had to come up here before class started to make sure I knew how to use these. So, okay, if you'd read Ephesians 6, 1 through 4.
Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children, instead bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord.
So I think we said this last week, but I want you to all say, I'm the boss.
I'm the boss.
And you sound, just like last week, you sound kind of lackluster that first time. I want you to say that again.
I'm the boss.
That's better. Now you really, really mean it this time.
I'm the boss.
All right. You know what? You're the boss. You know who said so? Who said so? God. God is telling you in this passage you're the boss, and He's telling your kids that you are the boss. You're the boss. You're going to discharge your boss role. You are a very benevolent dictator. But for a long time, you're a dictator. Very benevolent dictator. I can tell you, with my youngest child at 20 years old, you're not the dictator forever. And so today we're going to talk about how that works over time. How many of you have kids over, let's say, 9 years old? So you're in the second half, right, of parenting if it's 0 to 18. Anyone with kids over 12? Okay, all right. Okay, good, good. So in this style, love is first and emphasized with reasonable rules rationally explained. Love is first and love is most important. The rules are there because of the love, and they're reasonable and they're explained. We're back to that James 4:17 passage. If anyone knows the good he should do and doesn't do it, to him it's sin. If your children don't know what your expectations are, it's your job to make sure that they do. Number 2, the limits are set firmly and adhered to, within which, however, children have a lot of room to move. So they feel the limits when they bump up against them, but they have lots of room to move and do their own thing before they hit the limits. Number 3, right out of the How to Be a Hero book, it's like a fenced pasture. There's a large area inside those limits, a large area. Number 4, this style is always relational. The limits are lovingly enforced as they have been defined. As they have been defined. Number 5, the children feel parental control through the limits. They know you're the boss. They know there are limits, but they're confident all the time of their relationship with you because they know you love them all the time. They know even when they bump into a limit, even when they crash through a limit, they know you love them all the time, even when you're dealing with something. Number 6, and I think this is really important. This was really a cornerstone of how we raised our kids. The children have an opportunity to exert real influence. It's almost a negotiation at times, but the point is, it's not two equal parties negotiating. The children know you're the boss. They can appeal, they can reasonably explain something, and you're going to do what? What are you going to do? You're going to listen. Right back to James 1:19 and 20. You're going to listen. They know you're going to hear them out. This is quick to listen, slow to anger. James 1:19 and 20 again says quick to what? Slow to? What's the first one? Right after quick to listen, slow to? Speak, and slow to anger. I know I sound like a broken record, but I think our normal tendency is just the opposite. We get mad, we see something that we know shouldn't have been done or shouldn't be that way. We get angry, we start talking a lot, and we're listening almost none. Right? We're listening almost none. James says we should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And I have found that if I do lots of listening up front, I get angry a lot less often. If I can understand what's happening from my kid's standpoint, the percentage of the time that I have to get angry in that situation goes down a lot, because I now understand what they were thinking, what they were seeing. Misbehavior payoff is small. We talked about that a week or two ago. Sometimes we teach our kids that if they do something wrong, it gets very quick attention. And we're really teaching them exactly the opposite of what we want to teach them. They need to understand that the misbehavior payoff is small. The payoff for doing what we want is better. It's very positive. So, in our graph here, where is the autocratic style? I'm going to put the same numbers on here that are on the sheet here. 4, 3, 2, 1. Where's the autocratic style?
4.
It's number 4, right? Sorry about my handwriting. Where's the indifferent style? 3, right? There's just no real connection at all. Where is the permissive style? 2. And where's the balanced style that we're after? 1. Now, if we think about this graph, and if this is where we want to be lots of love. We want to have limits that are firm, but there's a wide area right inside those limits. But still, especially when they're small, we're going to really enforce those limits. What has to happen to this over time? Between age 0 and age 18, what has to happen to our position on this chart? Where does it go?
To 2.
Does it go to 2? Everyone agree with that?
Yeah.
It pretty much has to, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What happens if we're not letting our kids over time make their own decisions? I think we talked about this last week. Our goal is not to raise what? Our goal is not to raise good kids. How often do you hear someone say, I really want to raise good kids? I just want to say, excuse me, but no, you really don't. That's not really your goal in parenting. What you want to raise is what? Responsible adults. I would add responsible, Christ-centered adults. That's what our goal is. To do that, we have to be dropping the limits over time. So let's explore that just a little bit more. And who has Psalm 89, 30 through 33? Okay, if you'd read that.
If his sons forsake my law and do not follow my statutes, if they violate my decrees and fail to keep my commands, I will punish their sin with the rod, their iniquity with flogging. But I will not take my love from him, nor will I ever betray my faithfulness.
Okay, so God is saying right there, I will deal with it. Right? If I need to deal with something, God's saying I'll deal with it, but I won't withdraw my love and I won't withdraw my faithfulness back to my children. This is age 0. This is age 18. And these are love and limits. When your kids are born, how much do you love them? Hopefully, right? Especially that first one, you've never seen something like that was yours, you're holding it in your arms. For me, I'm sure for all of you, it's the same with all the rest of them. Each one is unique, each one is an absolute miracle. You want to think about this for just a moment, right? A fertilized egg is smaller than a period on the printed page in a book. It's smaller than that, and yet in 9 months, that speck that we can I think, if I understand it right, I think it's barely visible to the naked eye, but like you really have to look, you have to really strain to see it. Over 9 months, that speck becomes your first child. How much do you love that child? I would say it's probably up here. So we're going to use blue for love. What happens to that love over time? It stays the same, right? So we got 18, we got 30, we got 70, and by then you're probably going to kick the bucket somewhere in there, right? So basically, that love, hopefully, just stays way up there the whole time. Let's talk about limits. How much do your kids need in terms of limits when they're first born? Really none, right? So where would we say is the peak age for limits?
3.
We could go with 3,
3.5.
but what's the common expression? The terrible 2s, right? So I'm going to go with 2. So just for our purposes today, I'm going to go with 2. Now I will tell you, some of you met Katie when she was here a few weeks ago. She's our 3rd out of 4. I don't think I've shared this with you guys before, and I apologize. I'm 55 years old, so I can't keep everything straight anymore. But you know, with Eric and Kristen, we never had the terrible 2s. With Katie, we had the terrible 2s, 3s, and 4s to make up for it. And I tell people, if Katie had been our first child, she would probably be an only child, and I wouldn't be teaching anything. I'd already taught this stuff for a couple of years by the time she hit 2 years old. And I can still see her as a 2-year-old. I mean, I can see the tension in her face. She would twirl her hair just as a nervous habit. We'd come in the next morning, we couldn't extract her finger. We had to cut that little snippet of hair and then carefully cut it off of her finger. She was just really tightly wound as a toddler and as a preschooler.
Yeah.
Now, I will tell you, I think more children, more strong-willed children, are made than born. How many of you believe you have a strong-willed child? Most of you may believe you have one. I'm going to hopefully demystify that here in a few minutes. There are strong-willed children, I think, that are born. And I think Katie was a strong-willed child that was born. I'm here to tell you the same stuff works on your strong-willed child that we're talking about. It just takes longer, and you have to be more diligent and more persistent, but you cannot give up. You cannot give up. You just simply have to persist. So, let's draw our line. So from age 0 to age 2, limits increase, right, until they're in the terrible 2s. What happens for the next few years? Stays pretty high, doesn't it, for the most part? So maybe it varies a little bit in here, like so. Maybe somewhere here around 5 or 6, we start to get a hold of it a little bit. What happens after that? What needs to happen after that?
Start loosening.
You start loosening. What are you aiming at?
Teaching responsibility.
Teaching responsibility. What did you say over here?
Teaching them natural consequences.
Right? Which we're going to talk about natural consequences, but what are you aiming at for the purposes of this chart?
To be low by 18.
To be where by 18?
At the bottom.
At the bottom. That's exactly right. Now, so your goal is something, sorry about that, here, let's do this.
Some need nights, come on.
I'm sorry, we talked about perfectionism a few weeks ago. Okay, some of your kids kind of follow a straight line to get down there. Some of your kids, like my second child, my daughter Kristen. My daughter Kristen, I don't remember her ever getting a spanking. All I had to do was look at her and raise my voice like 1 notch, whatever that meant, and she would just burst into tears. She was compliant from the time she was born. Our oldest son was also pretty compliant. So with them, this curve probably looked more like that, right? We were able to turn loose of a lot more, a lot faster. Some of your kids really are strong-willed. Some of them really are strong-willed. And for them, your curve looks a little bit more like this, maybe. Right? So you end up with a football. You end up with a range of how you turn loose of those limits. But the point is, and this is really important, your goal as a parent is to establish your authority. And I would say with an iron grip, I think that's a little exaggerated compared to what I'm really imagining with that. But I would say, generally speaking, you need your kids to learn what you said before, that you are the boss. You need them to know, in no uncertain terms, that you are the boss. Once they know that, then your goal is to slowly but surely loosen up on that until they hit somewhere around age 18. If you haven't done that, if your limits are still up here and you send them to college, what happens?
They're ineffective.
They're ineffective. What are they probably going to do?
Crazy.
They're probably going to go nuts, right? These are the kids, not all of them, but a lot of these are the kids, and certainly the kids that really go nuts fall in this category. These are the ones that drink too much and party too much and don't study and end up flunking out after one very expensive semester in college. And this is not a good deal for anyone. So your goal, once you've established your authority, your goal is to slowly turn loose of it in whatever shape that graph might look like for each of your kids. And you're going to have days when you went down here and then all of a sudden something happens and you jump back up there again. Somebody's grounded, they lose some toys, they lose some privileges, they have to study for 3 hours a night, then you're going to drop it again, and then something happens and they lose the car keys and something happens in there. But the idea is, generally speaking, you need to have in mind that your goal is to raise responsible adults, and the way you do that is to slowly turn loose of your authority. To turn loose of it, you first have to get it, you have to establish it, and then you spend the rest of your parenting having a lot more fun turning it loose, letting them make more decisions. All right, let's go to the next page, and here we're going to define consequences. Who has the 1 Samuel passage, 1 Samuel 3, 11-13? Okay, Rachel.
And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. And at that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from the beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them."
So here God is judging Eli, who was a temple priest, because his sons blasphemed God and Eli failed to do anything about it, failed to restrain them, whichever version you're looking at. So here God, does anyone remember what God did to Eli's sons? Basically, they both died in one day. And it says Eli was a heavy-set man. He was sitting in a chair outside, and messengers came and told him both of his sons had been killed. I don't remember the circumstances as I'm standing here right now, but both of his sons died the same day. I can't remember if it's in battle or something else. And it says he literally keeled over in his chair. He fell over in his chair and died. Eli fell over the day that he heard that both of his sons had died. This is because he failed to introduce consequences. God doesn't use the word, or the scripture doesn't translate as the word consequences, but in concept, that's exactly what we're talking about. So here you have two definitions. Natural consequences are the consequences resulting from a child's actions in the absence of any intervention. Now I'm going to give you a translation to write down here. Scott's translation of this is, what will happen if you don't do anything? Natural consequences are what will happen if you don't do anything. So, what is the natural consequence of your child going to school without his coat on a cold day?
They are cold.
They get cold. What's the natural consequence of your child putting shoes on the wrong feet?
They hurt.
Right? They're pretty uncomfortable. That's the natural consequence. What's the natural consequence of your child forgetting his or her lunch? No, mom races to school with lunch. Okay, just kidding. That's not the natural consequence. The natural consequence is, as you said, the kid goes hungry. Is the kid going to die from going hungry one day?
No, this is
Not, yeah, unfortunately, I think, honestly, I think that's really unfortunate. It would be a lot better if our kids had to mooch off their friends, right? The school's probably going to feed them and send you a note saying you owe them $1.50 or something. How much is a lunch these days? How much is a school lunch?
$2.
Oh man, okay, you're going to owe $2. All right. What's the natural consequence of letting your child, your 2-year-old, play in the pool unattended?
They can drown.
Very likely would drown. What's the natural consequence of letting your child play outdoors in the front yard unattended?
You can run him from your car.
Could be run over by a car. These are all natural consequences. What's the natural consequence of your child never brushing his or her teeth? Huge. Besides a really bad case of bad breath, what's the natural consequence of that? They get cavities. Now, what's the problem with using natural consequences when we're talking about a swimming pool or playing out in the front yard? Too dangerous, too big. The natural consequence is too severe. What's the problem with using the natural consequence of your child not brushing their teeth?
You have to pay a lot of money to fix their teeth.
You have to pay a lot of money. And what's the problem using it with your kid?
They don't know enough to understand.
They don't know. The consequence seems like nothing, right? So in one case, you've got consequences way too severe. On the other extreme, you have natural consequences that are far too meaningless to the child in the here and now. Now, I would encourage you, whenever you can, to utilize natural consequences. If your child forgets his or her lunch, do not race to school with his or her lunch. If they forget their coat, do not race to school with the coat. If they put their shoes on the wrong feet, I can't imagine they would leave the door in that condition, but if they do, leave them. Let them do that. Let them face the obvious natural consequences, and they will learn a lot from that. Logical consequences, on the other hand, the definition here is predefined, communicated consequences which will be administered by a parent or other authority in the event of a given action by the child and which would not otherwise naturally result from the child's actions. So my plain English translation of that is the logical consequence is what you are going to do, because what will happen otherwise is either too much or not enough. So this is what you're going to do, because what will happen otherwise is either too much or not enough. So what's an example of a logical consequence? You're all using logical consequences. I know every one of you is using them in one way, shape, or form or other. So what's one that you use?
Reading in class, she has her books taken away at home.
Yeah, so when she's reading in class when she's not supposed to be reading in class, then she has her books taken away at home. That's a logical consequence. What's another one?
Back talking is grounding.
So grounding, so taking away some sort of privilege or the right, so to speak, or the flexibility to go out and play with friends. Good. What's another one?
Talking on her phone too late, she loses her phone.
Loses the phone. Talking on the phone too late, she loses the phone. Anyone use timeout anymore?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's a logical consequence. Does that happen without you doing it? Anything that happens with your children as a consequence that you do, where you intervene and make it happen, that's a logical consequence. So timeout's a logical consequence. How about spanking? Spanking is a logical consequence. And that's a very controversial topic today. You know what? It was a controversial topic 20 years ago when I started teaching this class. And we'll touch on spanking today. So, that's what a logical consequence is. Who's got Matthew 5:37?
I do.
Okay.
All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one.
What better way is there to establish your authority than for your yes to be yes and your no to be no? Was it you, Brad, that shared with me a story after class last week? Okay. Somebody shared with me a story about your parents left and went to church? It wasn't you.
No, it wasn't me.
Okay, somebody lived close enough to church.
Just own it.
And they, no, he'd have to make up the story again.
That was my husband.
Was it your husband?
Yes.
So I remember the story, but do you want to just tell it real quick?
Sure, the story is they lived in a small town, so they lived close enough to church. He was playing video games before church. They told him 3 times,
Yep.
turn off the video game, we're leaving for church, and basically said, we are going to leave you if you don't come. He didn't come. All of a sudden, he looked up, looked around, no one was there. They had gone to church, and he ran outside the house and ran to church, and of course was crying. And
He said it was just 3 or 4 blocks away.
Yes.
He knew where it was.
yeah, he knew where it was.
Right.
He could get there safely.
He was
Now-
19 years old.
That happened just last week. He was on his way here, and his wife said, "We're leaving. If we don't stop playing those video games,
That's
we're
right,
going."
buddy.
That's right. So, you know, his parents, now, what do you have to be careful with here? I would say
You actually have to do it.
his parents were brilliant to do that. But what do you have to be careful with?
You have to follow through.
You have to be able to do it,
Yes.
right? If you threaten this, you have to follow through with it.
But then what do you do about the children that, or the child that is, kind of looks around and is like, oh,
My
good,
child.
I got more time to play.
You know, here's the interesting thing. That's where each of you gets paid the big bucks to have specific children. Because you know what? The specific things that worked for my kids may or may not work for your kids. That's also where your community here is really helpful, because an idea that someone else used that worked for his or her kids may work for your kids. The thing I love about this material and the way the Hero book is organized is these 6 A's can be applied. I have yet to meet a situation that doesn't require medication, and I say that with all due respect and seriousness. I have yet to meet a situation that's one of attitude or behavior that doesn't require medication to deal with, that can't be addressed with some combination of these 6 A's. And so you've got to figure out, your question is an excellent question, you've got to figure out a consequence that's meaningful. So in your husband's case, I asked him, you know, did you ever do that again? And what did he say?
No.
Absolutely not. He never did that again. He knew from that point on his parents were 100% serious. When they said, we're going to leave without you, they would leave without him. They had proved it. Now, if they live 3 miles away, that's more difficult, isn't it? I took this risk one time. Our oldest, Eric, was about 2 years old, and we said, come on, it's time to go. And he sat down on the stairs, and he just said no, and he was all smiles. He's like, no, I'm not going. He didn't even look defiant. He just thought it was fun. I said, come on, it's time to go. Let's get in the car. He's like, nope, I'm just going to sit right here. So we walked out the door. I went out in the garage, and I started the car. And that door flew open, and out came, wah, wah, wah. I mean, I got his attention, but you know what? That was very risky, and I really shouldn't have done that. Because was I really going to leave without a 2-year-old? Leave him alone in the house? I was not going to do that. It happened to work, but I got lucky. That was before I'd read any of this stuff. He was probably 2. This book was published when he was 6. I hadn't read any of this stuff. I just got lucky. But if you can do that, to establish that what your yes means yes and your no means no, it's much better. What time is it? Is it 10:20 already almost? Okay. All right. Hebrews 12:11.
No discipline is enjoyable while it's happening. It's painful, but afterward there will be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way.
You know, when you've told your kids, if you do that again, you're going to get a timeout. If you do that again, you're going to get a spanking. And I'm going to talk about spanking here in just a minute. When they do that, when they pull that trigger, what do you have to do? You have to do whatever it is. You may not want to do whatever it is. You may not want to do it at that moment. I had lots of times I came home as dad, and there was some situation waiting for me to deal with. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have good family time that night, but it doesn't matter. Your goal in all this is what your kids need you to do, not what you want to do or what feels good to you in the moment. Your goal is what your kids need for you to do. I want to ask you guys a question. How many of you, I think all of you have had this experience, but you have a 10-month-old who's crawling around, right? Your little one's crawling around, and he or she spots an electric plug plugged into the outlet on the wall. And what do they do in that moment? What do they do?
Crawl to it.
Right? They crawl to it, and they reach out for it. And what do you do in that moment? Say it again.
No.
You say no, but do you say it like you say no? You say what? No. Now, what does your little one do in that moment?
Stop.
They stop and they're startled, right? They might laugh, right? They stop. What do they look at right after you say that? Well, first they look at you, right? You shout no, right? They're looking at the outlet. You shout no, and they look up at you.
And then they smile.
And what do they do?
Back to it.
Smile and go right back to
And
it.
what are they looking at this time?
Watch you.
What are they looking at the second time?
They watch you.
You. I want you to hear me here. What are your kids looking at the first time?
The outlet.
The outlet. What are they looking at the second time?
You.
Why?
To see if you're going to do it
Testing,
again.
they're testing to see if you're
They're
serious.
testing. What was interesting to them the first time? The outlet. What was interesting to them after that? You. Right? You were interesting to them after that. The very first week we talked about how parents are a blessing to their children. We talked about how children are a gift from God. We made the point that we are also a gift from God to our children. In fact, I would argue that apart from Christ himself, you as the parents are the most important gift God has made for your children, the most important provision that he's given your children. And if that doesn't prove this point, when your kids reach for that outlet the second time, it's not the outlet they're interested in anymore, it's you. You just did something that was new and different for them. And they want to find out if you will do that again. You never, never, never underestimate how fascinating and how interesting you are to your own kids. Honestly, I think most parents never get that. They just never get it. You are probably the most interesting thing in your child's life for a very, very long time. So don't take that for granted, and don't underestimate the influence and the opportunities that provides. Proverbs 13:24.
Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them.
And then Proverbs 23:13.
Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you punish them with the rod, they will not die.
Okay, now, I would say I don't think this is a mandate to spank, but it certainly leaves the door wide open for spanking. In the very first time I taught the class, I gave some guidelines to how we spanked. I used my hand a long time ago, and I had a chiropractor in the class, and he took issue with me afterwards, and it was a very enlightening conversation. And he said to me, among other things, he said, your hand and your arm weighs, I don't know, 5-8 pounds, something like that. And he said, I recommend a flimsy instrument that will sting when it hits their bottom. So a kitchen spoon, for example, a wooden spoon or a vinyl spoon, or go to Lowe's or Home Depot and get yourself a little piece of like 3/8" dowel and cut it in half. And also he said, you know what, that way you're not using your hand, which hopefully is reserved for love, to do spanking. Now, spanking is a very controversial topic. Some of you in a class this size may well have come out of an abusive home and may say, you know, I'm just never going to spank my child no matter what, because of what I went through when I was a kid. And what I would encourage you to do is follow what God lays on your heart and make sure what you're doing is what your kids need you to do. I would also say this, spanking is an effective, logical consequence for most children. However, I'm convinced there are some kids who are born with calloused bottoms. It just doesn't work. There are kids who just find it to be a challenge. How long can I withstand this? I'm not going to say a thing. I'm not going to scream. I'm not going to cry. I'm going to make mom just keep on going. One last point about spanking. And I'm not going to encourage you to use spanking, but I want you to understand I believe it can be used in the context of a completely loving parenting relationship, but it should only be used for situations that have been talked about in advance, and you should communicate to your children before you ever spank them. If you do that again, you're going to get 3 spanks. When you do that, what have you just done to yourself?
Committed.
You're committed, but you're also what?
Not responsible.
Well, that's true. You're giving them the choice, which is really our goal in a lot of these things, very perceptive, but you're also limiting yourself. What happens when we get really angry in a situation and we want to spank? How many spanks do we want to give those little? I'll stop short. Whatever I was going to say there, I won't say. How many spanks do we want to give them in the heat of the moment?
A lot.
Probably too many. Probably too many if we're really honest with ourselves about it. So if you say, if you do that again, I'm going to give you 3 spanks. Also, when they do that again, whatever that is, I highly recommend you sit down with them. You don't just rush in and spank. You sit down with them and you say, what was our deal? What did I tell you was going to happen if you did that again? You can even say, I really don't want to spank you, but we talked about this before and I have to. I wished you hadn't done that, but now I have to give you 3 spanks. Where's the spank stick, or where's whatever it is that we're going to use? So you've obligated yourself, you've also limited yourself. Take a time out, take a breather, talk to the kid about it before you give the spankings. That helps you to not spank so much in anger. Okay, did you have something you want to say? Yeah.
I have a question. What do you do when you have a house divided and one parent leaves the other?
That's tough. That's tough. I would say there's no requirement to use spanking, and I would say if you have a house divided and one parent really has to struggle with it, if you're able to get your kids, if you're able to establish your authority without spanking, I think that's fine. There are some kids that respond very well to spanking, and it seems there's not much else that'll work. I had one mom in one class who said, I spank and it doesn't matter. I didn't know what to tell her. And one of the other moms in the class said, well, why don't you try giving them a timeout? She said, well, they go to their room and they read books and play with toys. She said, why don't you give them a 10-minute timeout where they have to sit on your lap and do nothing? No book, no toys. That mom came back the next week and said, boy, that worked. That's exactly what I needed to hear. So I think if you have that situation, I think you just have to work something out that's acceptable to both parents. But both parents need to understand the importance of establishing your authority. You owe it to your kids to establish your authority. Yeah.
What were, in your house, what were spanking consequences?
Being outwardly mean to a brother or sister, where we had talked about this before, being defiant, lying was one. It depended on the kid. Katie, that you met in here, she's kind of fond of the notoriety of this today, but she got more spankings than all of our other kids put together. Eric got a few, Kristen, my wife thinks she got one. I don't really remember that. Katie got several. And today, and I will tell you, I also want to give you this word of encouragement. Today, Katie is the most delightful adult. She is very committed to Christ. She is very committed to social work, which is her career ambition. I can tell you a lot more about her, but I'm running out of time. But there is a lot. You must persist and you must be consistent with a bona fide strong-willed child. But I will tell you, more children are made strong-willed by parents who fail to establish their authority than are born. I am convinced that probably 2/3 of the children you see who are strong-willed have been made that way by parents who have not effectively trained them to accept their authority and not born. I want to leave you with two other thoughts very quickly. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say one thing. I think an important rule of thumb is to never spank when you're angry.
Absolutely.
And it's very effective as well, because you can send the child to their room and while they're waiting, that's way worse than the spanking anyway. But I just think it's worth saying to make sure that you're never angry.
I think you're right, and I would say, I think for most of us, there are times when we're still angry when it's time to give the spanking. I think you're completely right. And I think the practical reality is that again, if you've said 3 spanks, you know you're limited to 3 spanks, and that's all you're going to do. Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly add something to that. Both my mother and my sister in early childhood education, we go back and forth on spanking.
Mm-hmm.
Neither one of them are for it, but the reason they're not is because you shouldn't teach a child, in their view, to go to fists when they're angry, right? So I was waiting for Scott to say what he just said, which was, you should be calm when you're doing the spanking. You should not be resolving a conflict with violence or physical altercation. So that was their reason, and as I've gotten to that and listened to you, we've gone back and forth. But
it's a hard question for a lot of people. But you're right. It's not a conflict between you and the child. It's something you've communicated ahead of time. This is a logical consequence, and I'm telling you right now, this is what's going to happen if you do that behavior again. And to his point, they've made the choice at that point. When they do that behavior again, and they clearly understood that was the consequence, it's their choice to have received a spanking or a timeout.
I agree with what you were saying.
Yeah.
I think that the challenge with that is that the things that would deserve spanking, like he hurls it, like I have a 3.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old, and he hurls a toy right at her face. It's something that's like really it's hard not to get emotional in that time when you see your daughter hurt. Or,
you're right.
And so that's what I find.
I would also say this. I don't think the predefined categories have to be so narrow. If you throw a toy in your sister's face again, you're going to get a spanking. I think they can be, if you do something to hurt your sister, you're going to get a spanking. I think the categories can be broader than that.
Right.
But remember, your kids are smart, but you have to make sure they understand what you're saying. That's your job. Yeah.
With our older daughter, we use something we learned from a parenting class about how God corrects us. So once we step out of the circle, then we have to be corrected, and her correcting at that age was a spanking to get her back in the circle, back in the will of God. back into the family, whatever it was. But basically it was the circle that God, when we get out of it, He corrects us. So we had to correct her, and we talked to her about it and say, you know, because you did this, you step out of the circle, so this is how you get back in the circle and all that. So it worked pretty good for her.
I think I used an analogy like that when our son was mistreating his little sister at one time, that he was stepping out of the family circle by doing those things. I think that's good. And there, you know, there's any number of ways. I'm not here to give you one way to do this. I'm just telling you doing this somehow, whatever way works for you and your family, and within the confines of what we're told in the Bible, is really, really important. But how you choose to do that, there's lots of different ways you can choose to do it. A lot of you have verbalized things that I think are really valid. Let me just say one thing real quickly. I'm not gonna be able to get to the other points because that clock is just really in my face right now. So one other comment, and then some of you may have received a survey that Rachel emailed to you. If you have that filled out and you brought it with you, if you would leave it, please, I would really appreciate that. I have hard copies of it for those of you who will be here next week. Please just take one and then bring it back with you next week. Will you all commit to do that for me? That's the only thing I get besides the personal satisfaction, which is very high, by the way. The only thing I get for teaching this class is the surveys, and they are really, really important to me. So if you guys would fill those out over the next week, and I'll bring hard copies next week also for anyone that wasn't here today. Yeah, we'll close with your comment.
I think it's using the analogy of pulling this in this family circle and stuff. I think it's important to remember what the scripture said about thy rod and thy staff that comfort me. The idea that the rod was actually talking about the shepherd's rod and pulling the sheep back to them. And so it wasn't necessarily that the rod was something you hit your child with or something like that. It's that guidance and so not saying that, you know, we're not supposed to spank or we're not, you know, it's just the idea that rod is the idea of guiding them back in whatever method or way that we use it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, one of those passages does say if you beat him with the rod, he won't die.
Right.
So it's not always using the correct. But that said, I think you make a good point. And our whole goal, right, our goal here is to establish our authority by whatever means we're talking about, and then drop it over time. Okay? Thank you all for being here again today. I'm going to give a 10-second closing prayer, and if you guys, if you wouldn't mind if you grab one of these real quickly, I'd really appreciate it. Heavenly Father, again, I just thank you for these parents that are here, and I thank you for their commitment to their families, to their children, and maybe most important, to you. Thank you, Jesus, for the gift of our children. It's in your name I ask a blessing on these parents and on our time together. Amen. Thank you all very much.